Hi, John Biggs from TechCrunch here. I'm with Rob Schmitz from Marketplace, and we're going over a few of the things that he found in China when he essentially debunked the Mike Daisy piece on This American Life. Rob, in your experience, what has Chinese manufacturing over the past few years look like? How has it changed and how has it improved? And are a lot of these Daisy criticisms valid?
I think that the manufacturing scene in China in the last few years, from what we know, seems to be improving, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that labor is getting harder to find in China, and so that's made factories more desperate for labor, and of course they're giving better wages, better benefits to workers. They're improving the conditions steadily. Now that, when we talk about factories in China, there are millions of factory workers in China. So what we're talking about here, I think, are the electronics, right?
Sure.
And so the electronics usually, I mean, when we look at a company like Apple, that supply chain, obviously Foxconn is their biggest supplier, and Foxconn's a Taiwanese company. And as you know, you've been to the plant in Shenzhen. Foxconn is in Shenzhen, and if you talk to factory workers there, you know that it's one of the top factories actually to work at for workers in Shenzhen. So, and I think that hasn't changed. That seems to have stayed the same, I think, for the last few years.
The disconnect between Daisy's story, Daisy's theater piece, and the actual conditions in a ISO compliant factory were so distinct. It was, everybody wondered, were we doing something wrong? And I think the problem there is that folks were looking at that and saying that this is the truth. What would you say is the truth right now? What are the things that we should be concerned about as consumers buying this stuff, and what shouldn't we be concerned about? What has changed so sufficiently that there's really not that big an issue?
I think the truth is pretty complicated. I mean, when you think about how many employees that Foxconn has, they have a little over 1 million employees in China. And the scale of that, I think, is hard for a lot of people to grasp. I've talked to workers at Foxconn. I'm sure that you've talked to workers at Foxconn. Actually, when I was there talking to Kathy, I spent the morning talking to workers at Shenzhen.
Mm-hmm.
And it was funny, I asked the same questions that Mike Daisy asked. What would you change about Foxconn? And, people actually had answers about that. They didn't say, well, I don't know. Maybe it was the way I phrased it, but some of the biggest complaints that I found was that it's boring work. They said, a lot of people said it's pretty hard work. But one of the biggest complaints that I found was the food was bad, and this was after several employees that I talked to. So it just didn't really seem to encapsulate the issues in the way that Mike Daisy frames them in his monologue, where he focuses on the extremes. Like, he basically took some of the most extreme examples of worker abuses and these terrible things that have happened in the last 10 years of reporting in China, and claimed to have seen all of these things within the span of 6 days. So I think the real situation on the ground is actually pretty complicated to figure out. So you'd have to talk to hundreds of thousands of workers, I think, to figure that out. I think Foxconn has several factories in China. I think that each factory probably has its own issues. The one in Shenzhen's been under a lot of scrutiny because it's the biggest one. It's the one that had a lot of the suicide issues. And it was at one point one of the most notorious factories. But now Foxconn's got factories in Chengdu in the west of China, in Zhengzhou and Henan, up in Taiyuan. Last week in the Taiyuan factory, which is up in Shanxi province, around 400 workers protested because they thought that they were going to get a pay raise. And this is the pay raise that I think that basically emanated from a lot of the pressure that Apple was under.
Sure.
And they didn't get it. And these were the entry level workers, and they were under the assumption that they were going to get a pay raise, so they protested, which also is kind of interesting because the way that Mike Daisy talks about this and the way that he frames China is that no one has any rights to do anything. But here we have in Taiyuan 400 workers who didn't get their pay raise, and they're out there in front of the factory protesting.
Sure.
So I think if that's an indication of how things might be changing in China, is that people feel like they feel safe enough to protest, I think that that's a big sign.
It seems like there's this concept of I guess Western protection. We're trying to protect freedoms. We're trying to protect the workers here, and it's almost as if in many cases they don't need protection from us. They need protection from the bosses, that sort of thing. Have you heard anything specific about work practices that are damaging, that are dangerous?
No, I haven't. I've actually not even been inside a Foxconn
Hmm.
factory before. I've been in other factories here in China, but hopefully soon I'll be able to do that and figure that out for myself because I haven't. I've talked to workers, and the workers that I talked to in Shenzhen, they, for the most part, they didn't talk about any politics with their bosses, but that's something that, that's been in the press, right? When you see a lot of reports on this, I think that when you talk about the biggest problems that factory workers at Foxconn have, a lot of this is, the bosses are making us work overtime that we don't want to work. Usually factory workers do want to work overtime, and the factory workers that I spoke with a few weeks ago when I was there, that was one of the main things that they were there for. They want to work overtime, but sometimes when they're ramping up products, it becomes this issue where bosses are making them work overtime that they don't want to work. And I think that that is probably still an ongoing issue.
And then the constant refrain here from Daisy's side is that this is a piece of art. This would be the equivalent of a Woody Guthrie song or Grapes of Wrath,
Yeah.
something that doesn't particularly have to be true. I mean, just I wrote before that it's not like people are upset that Tom Joad didn't really exist, but the concept of Tom Joad and the concept of these abuses did exist, and those pieces of art actually changed things. In what way is Daisy's work art, and in what way is it journalism? And where did you find the problem in the mixing of the
Yeah.
two?
I think that's a really good question. I think that's a question that a lot of people need to ask themselves. And I think when they ask themselves that, they should look at Daisy's media record. I think it doesn't take that much searching on the internet to find how much he's actually been, not only on television, but also in the newspapers, as well as op-eds, magazine profiles. He's been on TechCrunch. He's been on like a lot of online news sites. And I guess, I don't have a problem with him saying that he's an artist because he actually, of course, is an
Sure.
artist. He's been an artist for many years and he's done this for a long time. And he's really been comfortable with straddling that line between truth and fiction in a very compelling way. But I guess the only issue that I have with him doing this at this time is that he spent the last year and a half allowing journalists to treat him like a journalist, where he goes on a show or on
Sure,
TechCrunch
sure,
and
sure.
says, I have seen this, and I've seen workers who were poisoned. I have seen underage workers. I have seen this and this and this, and some of those things aren't true. And so those media sites, in turn, trusting him, then give that information to their listeners, to their viewers, and to their readers. And so, in essence, he's put himself into the role of a journalist. He's not called himself a journalist, but I think his actions speak louder than his words in this sense.
All right, thank you. Rob Schmitz from Marketplace, talking about Mike Daisy and the Foxconn factory. Thank you very much for joining us, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.